Hey, this is Zito, front house engineer for OneRepublic, and I'm going to talk to you today about one of my all-time favorite bus compressors, the API 2500. I'm going to show you the basic parameters and controls of the plugin, and then we're going to go through and show you some applications. So the first part of the plugin that we're going to look at here is the basic controls, which everybody's used to on almost all compressors. We have the threshold, which is a point where compression starts. We have the attack of the compression, the ratio, and then the release. And on the API 2500, the attack and the ratio are fixed increments here. So in the attack, you can see from 0.03 milliseconds all the way up to 30 milliseconds, you can adjust the attack. On the ratio, you have a fixed 1.5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 10. And then on the release here, we have a quick release from 0.05, 0.1, 0.2, 0.5, and all the way up. And here's one of the cool features on the 2500 is the variable release. If you go all the way to the right with the release control, you're going to be able to vary the release all the way from 50 milliseconds all the way on up to 3 seconds. And when we get into some audio examples here, I'll show you why you might want to change some of those things. The coolest section on the API 2500 is the tone section. That is what makes this unit so special. The knee settings here, they're pretty comparable to what any other compressor's knee settings are, soft, a medium, and a hard knee. And that's when your input signal hits your compression threshold that we're going to set here, how hard, how fast it's going to start attacking. Whether once it hits it, it's going to start compressing right away, or a little bit slower as you see with a soft knee. What's really, really special, though, about this compressor and what sets this compressor apart from any other unit made and on the market are the thrust detector settings here. And it's super cool because what it allows it to do is it inserts a filter into the detection circuit of the compressor so that it changes the way that the compressor responds to input signal from low frequencies to high frequencies. In a normal setting, all frequencies are treated the same, all the way from the low end of the spectrum up to the high end of the spectrum. In the medium setting, there's a bit of a high-pass filter from 200 cycles on down and a bit of a shelf from 1K on up. And what this is going to do is it's going to compress the low frequencies a little bit less than the high frequencies. And then in the loud setting, which is one of the coolest things about this, it's pretty drastic. The high frequencies are compressed considerably more than the lower frequencies. And this is one of the ways that they get the real tight, low, punchy sound that that these API 2500 compressors are known for, because it's not compressing the low frequencies, the low end of the kick drum and your toms and your bass guitar when you're using it in a bus setting, as much as the high section. So it really gives you a thick driving bass on the low end, which is really, really exciting. Those options are available in both of the mono and the stereo version. And here we move into the link, which is only on the stereo version of the compressor. And this is super cool because it gives you here on the percentage, you have the option to have each channel working independently from each other, and then on up in a percentage. And this is the amount that the left side will affect the right side, or the right side will affect the left side. What's cool about this is in a situation where you're using it, let's say, as a drum bus compressor, and you have a nice wide stereo field on your drum bus, you may not want the tom, which is panned hard to one side, or a hi-hat panned to the other side, to be compressing the entire signal. Your snare or your overheads on the other side. It can be a little bit disorienting. So what you're going to want to do is, again, different situations we'll show you here, you may want to have more or less percentage and how they affect each other. Another cool feature is this shape here. And basically, it's going to allow you to insert a high-pass filter or a low-pass filter, or this band-pass filter, which is both a high and a low pass, so that when you hit a crash on one side, it doesn't affect the floor tom on the other side, or you hit a floor tom on one side, it doesn't affect your overheads on the other side. And so it gives you a lot more control in how you're using the plugin in the stereo bandwidth. And then looking here at the master output section, the analog modeling, as a live guy, I tend to always shut that off. Some guys really like it. There's a warmth that adds to it, but there's a bit of noise that it adds, which is part of the unit. In a recording, you may want to use this more because it's going to give you a bit of a vibe to it. I tend to turn it off when I'm using it live because all of those different plug-in channels add up and just add noise to the PA, which I don't necessarily want. This is an in and out of the compressor, and then the master output. One of the cool things with the API is that it has an auto gain makeup. So as you're driving your signal and hitting the compression, it's going to automatically bring up the output of the compressor to match the input. You don't have to try guesswork and punch it in and out and adjust your output level once you're hitting your desired compression. It does it for you. I use it in this auto setting when I'm using it as my bus compressor, or as my 2 mix or something along that lines, or as I'm going to show you here, my parallel compression. I tend to use it in the auto gain setting. When I'm using it on individual instrumentation like the kick and the snare, I tend to use it in manual gain setting. I use a compressor as a way of controlling my dynamic range of the instrument, and so sometimes I want to bring down the transient response of the instrument, get it to sit better in the mix, so I don't want that gain being made up at the end. So those are the basic controls. Let's jump into it and look at some examples of how we're going to use the compressor. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is how I'm using the API 2500 as a drum bus compressor. I will route all of my drums to this, all the kick, snare, hat, toms, overhead, the entire drum kit. I also tend to route percussive instrumentation if there's any sort of percussionist, bongos, congas, that sort of thing, as well as electronic percussion. Most of you I know, or a lot of you at least, are dealing with bands that have tracks that are happening during the show, maybe percussion tracks, loops, those sorts of things. I will also route those with the drums. Part of the challenge we face as engineers, we have to take all these different sound sources in a live show and make them sound like one cohesive thing. Bus compression is one of the ways that we do this. So here's my drum bus compression setup for this passage of music. We have just a standard rock drum kit: kick, snare, top, bottom, hi-hat, toms, and overheads. It's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to play you this the sample here. I'm going to start with the compressor off so you can actually listen to it on its own. All right, so that's pretty straightforward rock drum groove that we have happening here. So we're going to take and we're going to go ahead and put the compressor in here, and we're going to go for, we want to bring some life to the drums. We want to add a bit of snap to them, and we want them to all sound like they're playing together. So here's my basic approach. This is a starting point for you. We want the drums to be punchy. We want to have a bit of attack left, some of the transients left in them. So I go with a soft knee. I go with a fairly fast attack, but again, we want some of that front end transient to come through. So I'm starting with a 0.3. My ratio, personally, I like lower ratios. I'd rather drive the threshold lower and go with a 2-to-1 ratio, maybe a 3-to-1. But we just want to tap the meter, so we don't really want to crush it in this situation. Because again, this is my bus compressor, and I don't want the kick drum over pumping with the top end of the snare and the overheads. My thrust detector setting is on medium. And then I'm going for a smoother overall transient response, and so I'm using the old type feedback for the VCA setting. So let's listen to it with the compressor in. And we're going to adjust the threshold as this is playing, so that you can actually start to hear the compression take effect. And what we're going to watch the meters. We want to hit 2, maybe 3 dB compression, and you'll start to hear the drums start to glue together once we do that. All right, right there is the sweet spot. Actually, my thresholds just set it a little over at 0 dB, and you can start to hear everything coming together. So now let's A/B these inputs so you can actually hear the compressor in and the compressor out. You really hear the drums tighten up, the punch on the low end, and the way that the way it hits on the snare drum is awesome. I love that. So that's going to be our standard starting point for a 2-bus compressor. There's no wrong way to do this. Play with the stuff, find what works for you, but this is my starting point on it. The other way we're going to use this as a 2-bus compressor is actually as I'm going to call it a squash bus. This is parallel compression, and a lot of people are throwing that term around. Sounds really complicated. It's really, really simple. All we're doing with parallel compression is we're taking a compressed signal and we're going to mix it with an uncompressed signal or a moderately compressed signal. And you're going to blend these signals together. So what I have happening here is I have calling it the squash. This drum bus here, it is getting fed the same signal as the 2-bus mix that we just listened to here, and we're going to squash it. And we're going to add some sustain to the drums. It's going to really give them a ton of body, a ton of sustain, and we're going to blend that signal in. So on our standard bus compression, you can actually, we're letting some of those transients come through, so we're getting some of the attack, the front end of the hit. On the squash, we don't want that stuff to come through. Because we're blending the signals together, we want to make sure that we're catching some of those transients. Really, again, what we're trying to do is add a lot of sustain body to them. We don't need to have that attack. So we're going to adjust our threshold to get a lot of gain reduction, 6, 10, maybe 12 dB sometimes. Faster attack setting here, a higher ratio than what I had previously. And here we're going with 1.5. We might even bring that up once we start listening to it. And we want to start adding that sustain. Hard knee, because I don't want the transients in there. The thrust detector here I'm doing in the loud setting. It's the most aggressive, and the same thing with the tone type. I'm going with the newer style, which is more aggressive type of compression. In the link setting here, I have a 70% because I do kind of want them working together. This is a squash. I don't need to worry about the stereo field as much as in just a standard typical setting, and I have a high-pass filter on. So let's listen to this, this drum squash here, and let's get this thing really pumping, and then we're going to bring that back in with our regular signal that we just listened to. Pretty cool. What I'm going to do is actually take and bring the release, make it a little bit longer, add some sustain to it. Again, we're listening to this we have to picture how this is going to interact with the other bus that we have happening here. So we want a different sound out of it, a different tonality. So I'm going to actually bring the attack a little bit faster, a little longer release, and let's see if we can get some more sustain out of these drums. And you can really hear that snare start to crunch. Super cool. Okay, so now we're going to take that squash signal that we're really pumping with it, and we're going to listen to the whole mix. So first thing I'm going to do is we're going to listen to our master bus, which is the drum bus that we have happening there, and then I'm going to blend in that squash, the parallel compression, so you can start to hear the sustain and the grit that it brings into it. What a difference that makes. It's cool because you still get the attack that you're getting from the standard 2-bus track, but adding that parallel bus in there just starts to give the drums a lot of breath and a lot of sustain. It's just super fun. So experiment with that a little bit. You can, again, don't be afraid to mess with some of the settings. It's non-destructive. Have fun with it and play around with it. All right, so I just showed you a couple of ways that I use the API, the 2500 on the on both my 2-mix and on our parallel squash compression. And so the other way that I use it, and you can look at my desk right now on tour, I have them on my kick drum and my snare. I love I love this plugin. It's no exaggeration. I use it all the time. So again, originally designed as a bus compressor, but because of this tone function and the way that it detects the signal, it adds some really cool flavor to your individual instrumentation. So I'm going to show you it here on a kick drum. You can see my settings here. I tend to use the new type on an individual instrumentation, a medium knee on the kick, and I'm just going to take a little bit off the top. And I do this in conjunction. This is the setup in conjunction with my 2-bus standard drum bus, as well as the parallel compression. The parallel is an extreme example because in that situation, we're trying to get a lot of compression in one place because we want the breath and the movement. But typically, the way that I deal with any other instrumentation is I'm only taking a couple of dB off in different places, maybe a couple with the 2500 and then a couple dB off as the bus compressor, and I'm never over compressing too much in one place. So this is the chain. We are listening to the 2500 along on the individual input as well as the bus compressor here. And I've muted the squash for this example. So here is the kick drum. As you can see on my settings here, I have 0.3 millisecond attack, just 2-to-1 ratio. I'm adding a little bit of sustain with it, so we have like a 0.5 millisecond, a half a second release, medium threshold, and for the knee, the medium tone setting. Okay, so let's listen to that in and out. Excellent. And finally, I'll show you how I'm using it on the snare drum. Very similar settings here. And I'm actually going to take and flip through. I want you to listen to the tonality specifically on the snare drum that we're going to hear between the different thrust detector settings, which I've settled on a medium here, as well as the tone selector here. So let's just pop through these here so that you can kind of hear what they're doing with this snare drum. You hear that difference on the tone type? Tends to be a ton more top end. The smack that comes out with the new setting compared to the old style of compression, which depending on what you're going for, you may like. So we're gonna settle on that here. I'm gonna bring this threshold up because we're crushing it a little bit more than I want for just the standalone. And again, because I'm using it in this situation here, I don't wanna have it on auto makeup gain or it's gonna get out of control. I'm using it to control some of the dynamics, so I have it in manual gain mode here. Awesome, bringing out that smack. And now let's listen to the whole drum kit together again. Cool, hope you guys had fun. Experiment with it, it's a cool plugin, it's one of my favorites, and thanks for watching.